The boardroom was silent, except for the sound of Marcus Reed's breathing. 23 investors stared at him from across the table. 23 faces carved from stone and skepticism. Behind them, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the New York skyline like a jury waiting to deliver a verdict. The accusations had been thrown, the rumors planted, his reputation dismantled in real time by a competitor who smiled from the far corner of the room. Everyone waited for Marcus to speak, to defend himself, to fight back. But Marcus said nothing. He simply folded his hands on the table, looked each investor in the eye, and remained silent. 3 months earlier, Marcus Reed had been untouchable. At 32 years old, he'd built Reed Technologies from a dorm room idea into a $15 million company. Tech blogs called him the next visionary. Forbes mentioned his name in the same breath as legends. His calendar was full, his bank account was growing, and his confidence, well, his confidence was bulletproof. Until it wasn't. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning. An email from his largest investor, David Harrington, requesting an urgent meeting. The subject line was blank. The tone was cold. Marcus had dismissed it as routine. Investors always wanted updates, reassurances, control. But when he arrived at Harrington's office that afternoon, the air in the room felt different. Calculated, hostile. Seated beside Harrington was a man Marcus had never met, Owen Kraft, CEO of Next Gen Solutions, a direct competitor who'd been circling Marcus's clients for months like a vulture sensing weakness. Harrington didn't offer coffee. He didn't smile. He simply slid a folder across the desk. "These allegations surfaced yesterday," Harrington said. "Embezzlement, misrepresentation of revenue, breach of fiduciary duty." Marcus's chest tightened. He opened the folder. Inside were screenshots, fabricated emails, doctored financial documents, each one designed to make him look like a fraud. "This is fake," Marcus said, his voice sharp. "Someone planted this." Owen Kraft leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Fake or not," Harrington said, "the board is meeting in 3 weeks. If you can't prove your innocence by then, we pull funding. NextGen has already offered to acquire your assets at a discount." Marcus's jaw clenched. His pulse hammered. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to argue, to defend himself with facts and fury. But Owen Kraft's smile only widened. That night, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city lights bleeding through the rain-streaked windows. His phone buzzed endlessly. Journalists, former allies, investors, hedging their bets. Everyone wanted a statement. Everyone wanted him to respond. And Marcus wanted to scream. Instead, he opened his laptop and searched for answers. Articles on crisis management, legal defenses, PR strategies. Everything told him the same thing. Control the narrative. Speak first. Fight back immediately. But something stopped him. A memory. Years ago, when Marcus was still in college, his grandfather, a steelworker who'd spent his life in Pennsylvania mills, had given him a book, a biography of Andrew Carnegie. Inside the front cover, his grandfather had written a single line in fading ink. "Silence is the armor of the wise." Marcus had never understood what it meant. Until now. The next morning, Marcus drove 2 hours to his grandfather's old house in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The house was small, brick, built in the 1940s and stubbornly unchanged. His grandmother still lived there, though she moved slower now, her hands gnarled by arthritis and decades of factory work alongside her husband. She opened the door before Marcus could knock. "I knew you'd come," she said softly. Inside, the house smelled like bread and old paper. The walls were lined with photographs, black and white images of men in work clothes, women in aprons, children who'd grown into the faces Marcus recognized at family reunions. His grandmother poured him tea and sat across from him at the kitchen table. "You're in trouble," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded. "Someone's trying to destroy me, Grandma, and I don't know how to fight back." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, disappeared into the back room, and returned carrying a wooden box. Inside was the book, the autobiography of Andrew Carnegie, the same one his grandfather had given him years ago. But beneath it was something Marcus had never seen before. A letter, yellowed with age, written in his grandfather's careful handwriting, dated 1987. "He wrote this the year before he died," his grandmother said. "He told me to give it to you when you were ready." Marcus unfolded the letter. It began simply, "Marcus, if you're reading this, it means you're facing something bigger than yourself, something that makes you want to fight, to prove, to defend. Don't. I learned this the hard way, working under men who had nothing and men who had everything. The ones who survived weren't the loudest. They were the quietest. Andrew Carnegie once said, 'Silence is a source of great strength,' but it's more than that. Silence is a test. It reveals who your real enemies are. It forces liars to overplay their hand. It makes the truth rise to the surface without you having to drag it there. When someone attacks you, they expect a reaction. They need your anger, your defense, your desperation, because your reaction gives them power. But if you stay silent, if you refuse to engage, you become untouchable. The world will watch, and those who matter will see the truth. Not because you shouted it, but because you trusted it to speak for itself. Silence isn't weakness, Marcus. It's the only real power you'll ever have." Grandpa. Marcus read the letter 3 times. His hands were shaking. He sat there in his grandmother's kitchen, the afternoon light filtering through lace curtains that had hung in that window for 40 years. And something inside him shifted. Not broke. Shifted, like tectonic plates, finding a new way to rest against each other. His grandmother reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over his. "Your grandfather was a quiet man," she said. "People mistook it for weakness. They thought he had nothing to say, but he saw everything. He understood people in ways that talkers never do. He knew that the loudest person in the room is usually the most afraid." Marcus looked up at her. "Were you scared when he stayed quiet? When people misunderstood him?" She smiled, a small sad thing that carried decades of memory. "Terrified," she said. "But then I'd watch what happened. The liars would talk themselves into corners. The truth would emerge without him lifting a finger. And I realized he wasn't being quiet because he was weak. He was quiet because he was certain." Marcus felt tears sting his eyes. "I don't feel certain, Grandma. I feel like I'm drowning." She squeezed his hand. "That's because you're still fighting the water. Stop fighting. Float. Let the current show you where the lies are weakest. He'll make a mistake, this man who's trying to destroy you. They always do. But only if you give him enough rope. Only if you stay silent long enough for him to hang himself with his own words." Marcus drove back to New York that evening with the letter folded in his jacket pocket, pressed against his heart like a talisman. The city rose ahead of him, glittering and indifferent, a place where fortunes were made and destroyed before breakfast, where reputation was currency and silence was suicide, or so everyone believed. For the next 2 weeks, Marcus did something that terrified him more than any courtroom or boardroom ever could. He said nothing. Owen Kraft's team leaked more evidence to the press. Blogs picked it up. Former partners distanced themselves. Investors called for statements. Marcus's phone rang constantly. He didn't answer. His PR team begged him to release a counter-narrative. His lawyers drafted responses, elegant and aggressive, ready to be deployed like legal missiles. His closest advisor, his COO Diana, sat in his office one evening, nearly in tears. "Marcus, you have to say something," she pleaded. "They're destroying you." But Marcus simply shook his head. "Not yet. Not yet?" Diana's voice cracked. "When then? When there's nothing left?" Marcus met her eyes. "When the truth is louder than my voice." She stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. But Marcus had begun to notice something. In his silence, others started to speak. Employees who'd worked with him for years began posting on LinkedIn, not because he asked, but because they couldn't stay quiet. They shared stories of his integrity, his generosity, his refusal to cut corners even when it cost him profit. One software engineer wrote about the time Marcus had delayed a product launch because he discovered a security flaw, even though investors were furious. A project manager described how Marcus had personally paid for her mother's medical bills when her insurance fell through. These weren't coordinated. They were organic, unprompted, real. Clients he'd served started questioning the allegations publicly. "This doesn't match the Marcus we know," one CEO tweeted. "I've done business with Reed Technologies for 3 years. Every contract, every deliverable, every promise kept. Someone's lying, and it's not him." The narrative began to fracture, not because Marcus defended himself, but because his silence created space for others to defend him. And then, something unexpected happened. A junior analyst at Harrington's firm, a young woman named Priya, reached out to Diana privately. She'd been tasked with reviewing the financial documents Kraft had submitted, and she'd found something. The timestamps were wrong. The metadata didn't match. Someone had altered the files after the fact. Priya didn't have proof yet, but she had doubt. And doubt was enough to make her dig deeper. "Why aren't you defending yourself?" Priya asked when she finally met Marcus in a coffee shop far from the office, far from the glass towers and the eyes that watched everything. Marcus looked at her. "Because defense looks like guilt when you're innocent." Priya blinked. "That's the most terrifying thing I've ever heard." "Maybe," Marcus said, "but it's also the truth. Think about it. If I scramble to respond to every accusation, I'm validating the premise that I need to defend myself. I'm accepting the framing that I'm guilty until proven innocent. But if I stay silent, if I continue to lead my company with the same integrity I always have, then the burden of proof stays where it belongs. On them." Priya stared into her coffee. "I've been watching you," she said quietly. "Everyone has. And you know what's strange? The more Owen Kraft talks, the less believable he becomes. He's over-explaining, defending things no one even accused him of yet. It's like watching someone rehearse a lie so many times they forget what the truth sounds like." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's what silence does. It makes liars nervous. They fill the void with more lies, and eventually, the lies contradict each other." Priya looked up. "I'm going to help you, not because I work for you, but because I can't watch someone get destroyed for telling the truth, while someone else gets rewarded for fabricating it." Day after day, Marcus stayed silent. He showed up to work. He led his team. He reviewed contracts, attended meetings, maintained operations. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He simply refused to engage with the noise, and the noise got louder. Owen Kraft gave an interview on a tech podcast, smugly suggesting that Marcus's silence was an admission of guilt. If he had nothing to hide, he'd be defending himself, Kraft said, his voice dripping with false reasonableness. Innocent people fight back, guilty people go quiet, and hope it blows over. But something else happened too. People started to notice the contrast. Kraft talked constantly, defended himself preemptively, over-explained, appeared on podcasts, wrote LinkedIn essays, hired a crisis PR firm that pushed his narrative across every platform. He was everywhere, saying everything. Marcus said nothing, and somehow his silence made him seem stronger, more dignified, more certain. One evening, Diana sat across from Marcus again, this time with something close to awe in her eyes. "I don't know how you're doing this," she whispered. "Every instinct I have is screaming at me to fight back, to correct the record, to defend you. And you're just sitting here like a monk." Marcus smiled faintly. "I'm not doing anything. That's the point. Diana, do you know what Carnegie said about his competitors? That they would exhaust themselves fighting battles that didn't matter while he focused on building something that did. He didn't waste energy defending his reputation. He let his work be his defense. And in the end, the work outlasted every critic." "But this is different," Diana said. "This is your livelihood, your company, your life." "I know," Marcus replied, "and that's exactly why I can't afford to fight on their terms. If I engage with Kraft's lies, I'm playing his game. I'm letting him control the narrative, the timeline, the emotional stakes. But if I stay silent, if I let him talk himself into a corner while I keep building, then I'm playing my own game, and I win that one." Diana shook her head slowly. "I hope you're right, because if you're wrong, we lose everything." Marcus looked out the window at the city, at the lights that never stopped burning, at the endless hunger and ambition and cruelty that pulsed through every steel vein of this place. "I know," he said quietly, "but I'd rather lose everything staying true to who I am than win by becoming what he is." The board meeting arrived like a storm Marcus couldn't outrun. The conference room on the 42nd floor was packed. 23 investors. Harrington at the head of the table. Owen Kraft seated beside him, arms crossed, victory already written on his face like a signature on a contract. Marcus entered alone. No lawyers, no PR team. Just him, a leather folder, and his grandfather's letter folded in his jacket pocket. The room smelled like expensive cologne and old money, and the particular kind of fear that rich men feel when their investments are threatened. Harrington opened the meeting with clinical efficiency. "Mr. Reed, we've reviewed the allegations against you. Financial misconduct, breach of fiduciary responsibility, misrepresentation of company assets." He paused, adjusting his glasses, a small gesture of power. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Every eye in the room turned to Marcus. He could feel the weight of their judgment, their impatience, their readiness to believe the worst because believing the worst protected their money. Owen Kraft leaned forward slightly, eager, his hands clasped on the table like a predator watching prey stumble. And Marcus said nothing. He simply looked at Harrington, then at each investor one by one. His expression was calm, not defiant, not afraid, just present. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20, 30. People shifted in their seats, cleared their throats, looked at each other. Kraft shifted uncomfortably. Is he seriously not going to respond? "I'll speak when there's something worth responding to," Marcus said quietly. The room froze. Harrington's jaw tightened. "Mr. Reed, we're giving you an opportunity to defend yourself." "I don't need to defend the truth," Marcus replied. "It defends itself." Kraft laughed, sharp, mocking. "That's convenient when you have no defense." Marcus turned to him. His voice was soft, almost gentle. "You've spent 3 months talking, Owen, and yet you still haven't proven a single thing." The air shifted. Kraft's smile faltered. "You've doctored emails," Marcus continued, still calm, still steady. "Altered financial records, planted false evidence, and you did it all because you knew that if I fought back, if I scrambled to defend myself, I'd look guilty no matter what I said. That's absurd, Kraft started, is it? Marcus pulled a USB drive from his folder and placed it on the table. Because my team found the metadata, the timestamps, the IP addresses. Every forgery you created is traceable back to your network. The room went dead silent. Priya, seated near the back, met Marcus's eyes briefly. She delivered the evidence that morning, her hands shaking, her career potentially over, but her conscience finally clear. Harrington's face had gone pale. "Owen," Kraft stammered. You can't. I didn't say a word for 3 months, Marcus said, his voice still quiet, still steady, not because I couldn't defend myself, but because I knew that if I stayed silent, you'd eventually reveal yourself. Liars can't help it. They need to control the narrative. They need to talk, to explain, to justify. And the more they talk, the more they expose. He looked at Harrington. Silence isn't weakness, it's patience. And patience always wins. You think you've won. Kraft's voice rose, cracking. You think one USB drive changes anything? I'll bury you. Sit down, Owen, Harrington said sharply. Kraft froze, standing halfway out of his chair, his face red, his carefully constructed mask finally shattered. Mr. Reed, Harrington continued, turning to Marcus, we owe you an apology. A formal, public apology, and an investigation into these allegations against Mr. Kraft. Marcus nodded slowly. I don't want an apology, he said. I want the truth on record. I want every investor in this room to understand what happened here. Because this isn't just about me. It's about what we stand for. If silence can be mistaken for guilt, if patience can be weaponized as weakness, then we've built a culture where the loudest liar wins, and I refuse to be part of that. He stood. Kraft is right about one thing. I could have defended myself 3 months ago. I could have hired lawyers, launched PR campaigns, fought fire with fire. But I didn't, because Andrew Carnegie taught me something that every person in this room needs to remember. Real power isn't loud, it's steady. It's certain, and it's untouchable. The fallout was swift. Within 48 hours, Owen Kraft resigned from NextGen under undisclosed circumstances. Harrington issued a formal apology to Marcus and reinstated full funding. Several investors personally called to express their regret, their voices carrying the particular embarrassment of people who'd bet on the wrong horse. But Marcus didn't gloat. Didn't give interviews, didn't capitalize on his vindication. He simply returned to work. 1 week later, he stood in front of his team, 50 employees who'd believed in him even when the world didn't, who'd showed up every day while the company bled reputation, and the future seemed uncertain. I owe you an explanation, Marcus began. No, you don't. Diana said from the front row. You showed us something better than an explanation. You showed us what integrity looks like, what strength looks like, what it means to trust yourself when no one else does. Marcus smiled faintly. I showed you what silence looks like, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is trust the truth to prove itself. He paused, looking around the room at faces he knew as well as his own reflection. Faces that had been with him through every late night, every pivot, every impossible deadline. Andrew Carnegie built an empire not because he shouted the loudest, but because he knew when to stay quiet, when to let his work speak, when to let his character be the only defense he needed. That's the rule I want us to live by. Not just in business, but in life. When someone attacks you, don't rush to defend. When someone lies about you, don't scramble to correct. Stay silent, stay grounded, and let the truth do what it does best. The room was completely still. Because silence, Marcus said softly, is the only power no one can take from you. They can take your money, your reputation, your opportunities, but they can't take your certainty. They can't take your integrity. And if you stay silent long enough, if you trust yourself enough, the truth will surface. Not because you forced it, but because lies eventually collapse under their own weight. A young intern in the back raised her hand hesitantly. Mr. Reed, what if the truth doesn't surface? What if staying silent just lets the liars win? Marcus considered the question carefully. That's a real fear, he said, and I'm not going to lie to you. Silence isn't a guarantee. It's a gamble. But here's what I learned. Every time you defend yourself against a lie, you give that lie legitimacy. You validate it as something worth responding to. But if you stay silent, if you keep living your truth so loudly that words become unnecessary, then one of two things happens. Either people see the truth on their own, or the people who matter already know. And the people who don't matter reveal themselves by choosing to believe the lie. Either way, you win, because you didn't compromise who you are. You didn't become reactive, defensive, desperate. You stayed untouchable. The intern nodded slowly, and Marcus could see something shift in her eyes. The same thing that had shifted in his grandmother's kitchen weeks ago. 6 months later, Marcus received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a check for $2 million, a settlement from NextGen's board after Kraft's schemes were fully exposed. But beneath the check was a handwritten note from Priya. Mr. Reed, I almost didn't come forward. I was terrified. I kept thinking about my career, my reputation, what would happen if I was wrong. But watching you stay silent while the world screamed, it gave me courage. You taught me something I'll never forget. Real power isn't loud, it's steady, it's quiet, and it's untouchable. Thank you for showing me what that looks like. I'm leaving Harrington's firm, starting my own financial consulting company, and the first principle I'm building it on is the one you lived. Silence is strength, patience is power, and the truth always rises. Thank you, Priya. Marcus folded the note carefully and placed it beside his grandfather's letter in the wooden box his grandmother had given him. 2 pieces of wisdom, 2 generations, the same truth. That evening, Marcus stood on the rooftop of his building, watching the city lights flicker like stars reflected in glass. The air was cool, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. And somewhere far below, sirens wailed, and people rushed, and the great machine of ambition ground forward without pause. His phone buzzed. A notification, another interview request, another invitation to tell his story, to capitalize on his vindication, to become a thought leader on crisis management and reputation defense. He turned off his phone and smiled, because some victories don't need to be announced, they just need to be lived. Marcus thought about his grandfather, a steel worker who'd never made headlines, never built companies, never stood in boardrooms with men who measured their worth in zeros. But he'd understood something that most people spend their whole lives trying to learn. That silence isn't the absence of power, it's the presence of control. He thought about Andrew Carnegie, who'd risen from poverty to become one of the wealthiest men in history, not by fighting every battle, but by choosing his battles so carefully that he rarely needed to fight at all. Who'd understood that reputation isn't built by defending yourself, but by building something so undeniably valuable that defense becomes unnecessary. And he thought about himself. About the man he'd been 3 months ago, confident and untouchable in all the wrong ways, and the man he'd become, still confident, still strong, but now with a different kind of certainty. The kind that doesn't need validation, that doesn't need applause, that simply knows. Marcus pulled out his phone one more time and opened the voice memo app. He wanted to capture this feeling, this moment, this clarity, because he knew that someday, maybe years from now, he'd face another crisis, another Owen Craft, another moment where every instinct screamed at him to fight back, to defend, to prove. And he wanted to remember what he understood right now. He pressed record. To whoever finds this, he began, his voice soft in the evening air. If you're listening to this, it means you're facing something that feels bigger than you. Something that makes you want to scream your innocence to anyone who'll listen. Don't. I know that sounds insane. Every article, every expert, every well-meaning friend will tell you to control the narrative, to get your side of the story out there, to fight back immediately and aggressively. But I'm telling you something different. Stay silent. Not because you're guilty, not because you're weak, but because you're certain. Because you know that truth doesn't need a megaphone. It just needs time. When someone lies about you, they're counting on your reaction. They need you to get emotional, defensive, desperate, because your desperation validates their accusation. It makes you look guilty even when you're not. But if you stay silent, if you refuse to engage, something incredible happens. The liar has to keep lying, has to keep talking, has to keep explaining and justifying and defending. And eventually, the lies contradict each other. The story falls apart. The truth emerges not because you forced it, but because lies can't sustain themselves without someone to fight against. I learned this from my grandfather. He learned it from Andrew Carnegie. And now I'm passing it to you. Silence is power, not passive silence, not hiding, but active, conscious, deliberate silence. The kind that says I don't need to defend myself because I know who I am. The kind that trusts the truth to speak louder than any defense ever could. So stay quiet, keep working, keep building, keep living your integrity so loudly that words become irrelevant. And watch what happens. Watch how your silence forces everyone else to reveal themselves. How it separates real allies from fair-weather friends. How it makes liars overplay their hand. How it gives truth the space to surface naturally. You might lose some battles. Some people might believe the lies. But the people who matter, the people whose opinion actually shapes your life, will see the truth. Not because you convinced them, but because you trusted them to see it on their own. That's the Carnegie rule. That's what makes you untouchable. Not wealth, not power, not even truth itself, but the quiet certainty that you don't need to prove anything to anyone, because you already know. And that knowledge is the only real power you'll ever have. Stay silent, stay strong, and trust the truth to do what it does best. Rise. Marcus stopped the recording and looked out over the city one more time. Somewhere down there, Owen Craft was probably planning his next move, his next victim, his next lie. And somewhere else, Priya was building something honest, and his team was going home to families who'd never know how close they'd come to losing everything. And his grandmother was sitting in that small brick house in Pennsylvania, probably smiling, knowing that her husband's words had traveled across time to save his grandson. Marcus touched the letter in his pocket one more time, feeling the worn paper, the faded ink, the love that had been preserved in silence for decades, until the moment it was needed most. Silence is the armor of the wise. He finally understood, not armor that protects you from attack, but armor that makes you untouchable, because you no longer fear the attack, because you know that no accusation, no lie, no reputation wound can touch the core of who you are, unless you let it, unless you react, unless you give it power by treating it as something worth defending against. 3 months ago, Marcus had been untouchable because nothing had ever truly tested him. Today, he was untouchable because everything had tested him and he'd refused to break. That's the difference between arrogance and certainty, between false confidence and real power. One crumbles under pressure, the other deepens. Marcus went back inside, back to his apartment, back to the life he'd almost lost, and then found, again in the silence. Tomorrow he'd return to work. He'd lead his team. He'd build his company. He'd face new challenges, new competitors, new crises. But he'd face them differently now, not with words, not with defense, not with the desperate need to be understood, but with the quiet certainty that truth doesn't need a defender. It just needs time and patience, and someone willing to stay silent long enough for it to speak. Silence is not the absence of power. It is the presence of control. Andrew Carnegie knew this when he built his steel empire, not by shouting down competitors, but by letting his work, his character, and his silence speak louder than any defense ever could. Marcus Reed learned it in a boardroom where 23 investors waited for him to break. And he didn't. Because silence is a test. It reveals who your real allies are. It exposes the lies of your enemies. It forces the truth to rise without you having to drag it to the surface. When someone attacks you, they expect reaction. They need your anger, your justification, your desperation. But if you stay silent, if you refuse to engage, you become untouchable. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you know that some battles are won not by fighting, but by standing still while the storm rages around you. The world will watch, and those who matter will see the truth. Not because you shouted it, but because you trusted it to speak for itself. So the next time someone tries to destroy you, remember Marcus. Remember Carnegie. Remember the grandfather who worked in steel mills and understood power better than men who'd never touched a tool in their lives. Remember the rule that makes you untouchable in any situation, today, tomorrow, and every moment that tests who you really are. Silence is power, real power, the kind that can't be bought, stolen, or destroyed. The kind that lives in the space between words, in the breath before response, in the decision to trust yourself so completely that you don't need anyone else's validation. And power, true power, is knowing when to use it, not by speaking, but by choosing not to. By letting your life be so loud, your integrity so clear, your certainty so unshakable that words become unnecessary. That's what Andrew Carnegie understood. That's what Marcus Reed discovered. And that's what you can carry with you into every boardroom, every crisis, every moment when the world demands that you defend yourself, and you choose, instead, to simply be yourself. Untouchable, unshakable, silent. Because sometimes, the greatest response is no response at all. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say is nothing. And sometimes, the only way to win is to refuse to play. If this story reminded you of the strength that lives in stillness, the dignity that lives in silence, and the power that lives in simply being untouchable, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that prove the quietest voices often change the world. Because in a world that never stops talking, that measures worth in noise and visibility and constant performance, the rarest and most valuable thing you can offer is the courage to be silent, to trust, to wait, to know, and in that knowing, to become truly, finally, completely untouchable.